Throughout the history of paleontology, there have been few debates as long-running and potentially heated as those involving the tyrant lizard king. Amongst this discourse, one debate stood above many in a class all its own. In the final days of the Mesozoic, did Tyrannosaurus reign over its North American domain alone as the last and greatest of the tyrannosaurs, or did another enigmatic heir to the tyrant reptile legacy stand short in its own way? Nanotyrannus was a name that once invited chaos and sparked division at the mere mention of it for decades, but it might now go down in history in a whole different way. So, how did we get to this point? A point at which, right before Halloween 2025, a seemingly long-buried genus of dinosaur came clawing its way out of its taxonomic grave. I know I've said countless times in my other videos that I don't really ever want to touch the Rex v Nano debate, but now is the perfect time to, considering what has been discovered. I've talked about Montana's Dueling Dinosaurs twice before. I've tried to stay away from anything Nanotyrannus due to the 4,000 words I just wrote and then spoke to you. Lots of back and forth, lots of interesting tidbits of info gleaned from the nearly eradicated corpses of long dead dragons, and maybe just a teensy bit of ego. You should go check out those 2 other Nanotyrannus videos for fuller context regarding the Montana Dueling Dinos specimen. If you really want me to make a dedicated video to this specimen as opposed to those shorter, older, news-related videos, just make sure to bug the shit out of me. Like, seriously, I need you to goad me into something like that. I won't leave you hanging here though. The Montana Dueling Dinosaurs is a specimen of a Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus seemingly locked together. Both the Triceratops and Tyrannosaur are remarkably complete, with the Tyrannosaur a small, seemingly immature animal. The specimen was found in 2006 by Clayton Phipps, Mark Eatman, and Chad O'Connor on private ranch land owned by the Severson and Murray families in the Montana Badlands. The specimen remained unknown to the greater paleoenthusiast circles and the public, probably because the crew had to field prepare, jacket, and take the whole thing to a building to then painstakingly prepare as much as they felt was needed until 2011, at which time Phipps and Pete Larson launched a website and a campaign to get this thing sold to the highest bidder, ever the budding capitalists they are. Of course, they would love to see it go to a public institution, but if a private outfit were to swoop in and provide the millions they initially asked for, they would get it, and no one would be the wiser. To be fair to these guys, they tried to sell it first to the Smithsonian and Museum of the Rockies, with no luck. It was then that the specimen was going to go to some private collectors when Pete Larson tried to do something a little wacky. He made a presentation and public plea to any potential buyers in the public and publicly connected part of the private sector at the 2013 Society of Vertebrate Paleontology Conference, but to no avail. Several years and no buyers later, Lindsay Zanno of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences came to start negotiative talks with the guys circa 2016. That's when even more controversy struck this already bloated mess. It deserves a film. Maybe it's not as crazy as the Sioux debacle, but it's still pretty dramatic. Zanno wanted to get some of the millionaire and billionaire museum donors to band together to get this specimen, but it turned out that the 2 families who owned the land it was found on decided only then to start arguing with one another about who actually owns the specimen. No doubt from hearing the price tag numbers under negotiation. I mean, I don't really blame them, as I would want a cut of it too. That said, I'm probably much less well off than any random rancher, so 6, 7, or half a dozen of the other, really. One family argued they owned the fossils because the fossils are made of minerals and they had the mineral rights to the land, while the other family said that the fossils aren't the same thing as mineral resources despite being made of minerals, and so they don't count as part of the mineral rights laws. One court case had ruled in favor of the Murrays, and then a 2018 court case ruled in favor of the Seversons, only to flip again back to the Murrays due to a 2020 appeal. This has much broader implications for the private and academic collection of fossils nationwide, but I don't need to get into that here. Suffice it to say, we got the good ending. The Murrays got the specimen, and the Murrays and Clayton Phipps and Co. sold the damn thing to Zanno's museum, finally accessioning the things as of 2020. The next several years saw the museum construct a new wing to act as a live open-air fossil preparation lab, to both display the dueling dinos and show people how science is done directly, pick by pick. The state-of-the-art facility completed their work and published the first of many papers on the Tyrannosaur half of the specimen in 2025 in the journal Nature. Woodward et al. 2020. But before I get to the meat of the debate and the reason you're here, I want to edge science you a little bit. Like I keep whining about, there's a lot of paperwork with this topic. One of those pieces of paperwork was published in 2020 in Science Advances by Holly Woodward and a big old team of boners. Boner experts. Bone scientists. You know.
Oh, you know the thing.
In order to prove what the hell was going on with Jane and a second very fragmentary specimen called PT and labeled as BMRP 2006.4.4, they needed to go inside the bone. You know, really cut some hefty slices of that stuff. With some thin slices, they could tell roughly how old the dinosaurs were when they kicked the bucket. That seemed to matter here because if Jane was an adult, that would mean that it couldn't possibly be a juvenile Tyrannosaurus. If it turned out to be a juvenile, that would still leave some wiggle room. It could be a juvenile Tyrannosaurus or a juvenile of an unknown Tyrannosaur. So this team sliced up some bones, mounted those slices on microscope slides, and placed them under the microscope and under several different wavelengths of light. This technique found that Jane was around 13 at death, and PT was around 15 years old. However, due to a lack of things called cyclical growth marks, the ages at death were minimums, and they may have been older. The researchers found that these critters were growing at similar rates to birds and mammals, and that they had not entirely ceased growing. Boy, were they wrong. They were right, but also wrong. Everything will become clear to you. Longrich and Saitta, 2024. Some individuals pressured SciCommers to ignore this study when it came out due to those involved in the study, but now that some of its results have been partially vindicated and since I'm taking the time to cover the entire Nanotyrannus saga, I figured it feels more relevant. Nicholas Longrich and Evan Saitta published a paper on the Nanotyrannus debate in 2024, arguing that there are multiple lines of evidence that prove Nanotyrannus is a valid genus. This was before the Dueling Dinosaurs specimen was published, so this team had to work with less data. To conduct their grisly business, the two scientists did a cluster analysis. This means that they put a bunch of Tyrannosaurus and purported Nanotyrannus specimens into a tree-like diagram called a dendrogram that groups similar data points together based on traits they do or do not share. In this case, they used 158 traits the two could possibly have and let the software do some of the computing. Longrich and Saitta also did some histology, the study of microscopic tissues and soft or hard tissues observed by thin sectioning those tissues, mounting them on microscope slides, and looking at the anatomy under the scope and with different wavelengths of light. Unfortunately, this team doesn't seem to have actually done any actual histologic sampling themselves. Fortunately, that's not inherently incorrect, and here this means they took data from sections made of appropriate bones from FNMH PR 2081, or SU, BMRP 2006.4.4, or PT, BMRP 2002.4.1, or Jane, and SWAU HRS 081514, or Zuri, from various scientific papers published in the past. Why bother making new histologic samples of these precious specimens when they've already been made? Unless we're to find something wrong with a given sample, of course. Next, the two also did an actual phylogenetic analysis using the PAUP software and two matrices of a bunch of Tyrannosaur data that had already been published. Into these matrices, they put a composite Nanotyrannus, which mishes the anatomical information from Jane, the Cleveland skull, LACM 28471, or the Jordan theropod, and Zuri. After all these analyses, Longrich and Saitta found that it was most likely that Nanotyrannus was valid. Longrich and Saitta list their reasons thusly, quote, 1. High diversity of tyrannosaurs and predatory dinosaurs supports the idea that multiple tyrannosaurs inhabited the late Maastrichtian of western North America. 2. Nanotyrannus lacks unique traits that would refer it to Tyrannosaurus, or even the Tyrannosaurinae subfamily, and differs from Tyrannosaurus in over 150 anatomical traits. On top of that, no intermediate forms between Nanotyrannus and Tyrannosaurus exist, which should if one is the juvenile of the other. 3. Histology shows specimens of Nanotyrannus with skeletal fusions, mature skull bone textures, slow growth rates relative to T.rex, decelerating growth in their final years of life, and growth curves predicting adult masses of roughly 1,500 kilograms or less, indicating these animals are subadults or young adults, not juvenile Tyrannosaurus. 4. Growth series of other tyrannosaurids, including Tarbosaurus and Gorgosaurus, don't show the extreme levels of anatomical change proposed for a Nanotyrannus to Tyrannosaurus growth series. And deriving Tyrannosaurus from Nanotyrannus requires several changes inconsistent with known patterns of dinosaur development. 5. Juvenile T.rex exist, showing diagnostic features of Tyrannosaurus. And 6. Phylogenetic analysis suggests that Nanotyrannus may lie outside Tyrannosauridae, which shouldn't occur if it were a juvenile of T.rex, even if Tyrannosaur juveniles retain features present in older Tyrannosaurids." End quote. Okay, maybe a paraphrase just a tad there, still gonna throw on some quotation marks there, even though you don't actually see them. Well, unless I want you to, and at this point, I don't think I do. I mean, what do you think? I kind of think that when it comes to quotes, a video editor should either put the quote up for people to read and not read it aloud, or read it aloud but don't put the quote up on screen. I used to like having a funny voice to read quotes, but that kind of works better for historical accounts and such. Anyways, Longrich and Saitta found that
The One Piece is real!
But no one really cared because it was published by Longrich. Valid? I don't know, maybe. Not up to me. Thomas Carr did a talk at the 2024 Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conference rebutting the Longrich and Saitta 2024 paper. Carr said that there should be anatomical differences between Nanotyrannus and Tyrannosaurus if Nanotyrannus is a juvenile of Tyrannosaurus. He's right that the mere existence of moderate to even extreme anatomical difference between the two is not an argument for the separation of the two outright. The second point made by Longrich and Saitta, that there are no definitive intermediate growth forms between the two tyrants, is just plain wrong. This one is, nuh-uh. Not much to explain there. The third point is that the level of extreme change from Nano to T.rex is not seen in the growth of other Tyrannosaurs. Carr says nuh-uh and points to the growth series of Albertosaurus, Daspletosaurus, and Tarbosaurus. Okay man, that's cool. I think this was more about the two disagreeing on the same data and specimens. The lack of a really good adult specimen is the major issue here. At the same 2024 SVP meeting, Christopher Griffin and colleagues who had previously done a poster presentation at another SVP meeting about an histologic study on the Zuri specimen from which Longrich and Saitta got their data for Zuri, did a poster proving that the Cleveland skull was an adult at death, using histologic samples of the hyoid or tongue bones. They think that Nanotyrannus is valid, but sadly this was never a published paper. Okay. Now we can finally end this traumatic back and forth cycle and get into what Lindsay, Zanno, and colleagues cooked up for us in the big 2025. Zanno and Napoli 2025. With enough of the dueling dinosaurs, Tyrannosaur, nicknamed Bloody Mary, prepared out of the Matrix, the North Carolina Museum's crew were able to observe, measure, and test every anatomical trait preserved in the nearly 100% complete skeleton, and compare it with every other known Nanotyrannus-like Tyrannosaur to finally get to the bottom of what the hell this thing is. Lindsay, Zanno, and James Napoli published their work in Nature almost on Halloween 2025. The study focused on Bloody Mary, now accessioned as NCSM 40,000, as well as other Nanotyrannus specimens and Tyrannosaur specimens. Right out the gate, something that had been talked about for ages was proven very demonstrably true. Nanotyrannus had absolutely and proportionally larger arms than any adult Tyrannosaurus. All other Nanotyrannus specimens were lacking in the arm department. Jane, for example, only had a few isolated hand and arm bones, making the argument between growth changes, individual variation, and evolutionary differences more or less ambiguous. It was thought that juvenile tyrannosaurs might have had proportionally longer arms that grew slower as they matured, but this doesn't appear to be nearly enough to account for the difference. Numerous other differences were also found. Nanotyrannus had a unique set of hollows in the cheekbone region unknown in other tyrannosaurs, and totally lacked a common blood vessel opening at the tip of the snout called a subnarial foramen. Obliteration, resorption, and remodeling of these bones as part of growth is totally unseen in any other land animal, and seemingly small differences like this are very often a sign of a unique genus or species. There also proved to be far fewer similarities between Nanotyrannus and Tyrannosaurus than previously thought. Essentially, almost any time they did resemble each other, those similarities were also found across the entirety of the Tyrannosaur family, and would not align Nanotyrannus with Tyrannosaurus specifically. If Nanotyrannus was genuinely a juvenile of a larger species, then it could have grown up to become any type of Tyrannosaur, not specifically Tyrannosaurus itself. This is contrary to growth cycles seen in both birds and crocodilians. A juvenile Nile crocodile and juvenile saltwater crocodile may not look exactly like their parents, but skeletally they can be distinguished from each other by traits that align them with their respective parents. Insights into the growth of Bloody Mary also made waves in another way. One of the arguments against Nanotyrannus' validity was that there were no adult Nanotyrannus specimens, and all of the individuals found were seemingly still growing at the time of death. Bloody Mary proved to be an adult. A cross-section of its bones showed it had been growing for at least 14 or so years, but hadn't grown much at all for some years after. This individual had multiple layers of arrested growth, showing it was more or less at its adult size. Bloody Mary seemed to be somewhere between the ages of 17 and 22, noticeably older than the Jane specimen's age of between 8 and 15, despite being of slightly smaller size. This meant Bloody Mary was well within the age of known large Tyrannosaurus and absolutely wasn't the same genus. But if Jane was nearly the same size, if not larger than Bloody Mary, why was it younger? That's where the second surprise came in. The pair of egghead scientists took an in-depth look at Bloody Mary and Jane, but also the original Cleveland skull and several other specimens that had distinguishing traits indicating they were all members of the same genus. While they all have traits allying them to the known species Nanotyrannus lancensis, Jane was a freaking weirdo in several respects. Jane was still clearly a part of the same genus, as there were far more similarities between it and the Nanotyrannus lancensis specimens, but there were a few differences in the anatomy. These included a straight neural spine on the axis, several pleural seals or air holes in the axis, multiple air chambers in the tail vertebrae, and an adult size somewhere around 700 kilograms. Jane, meanwhile, had an axis with a crenulate or ridged anterior surface, and only one pleural seal, more solid tail vertebrae, different sinus and foramen shapes in the skull, and was already well over 700 kilograms when it died, with a potential adult mass north of 1,200 kilograms. With this in mind, Jane was erected as the holotype for a brand new species, Nanotyrannus Lathaeus. Named for the mythological river where one could forget old memories, Lathaeus was chosen as a symbolic gesture of Jane casting off its old identity as a juvenile tyrant king in the making and stepping forward as the first known member of a brand new species. Nanotyrannus lancensis and Nanotyrannus Lathaeus both have very similar builds. Leggy and lean, just how I like my whatever. The 2025 study describes them as hypercursorial, which is just a fancy word meaning that they are really good at running, with extremely long legs relative to their body size to give them an impressive stride without too much weight slowing them down. Prior studies on some of the specimens back when they were identified as juvenile Tyrannosaurus indicated that Nanotyrannus were potentially amongst the fastest of all predatory theropods, with speeds somewhere between 31 to 52 kilometers per hour. This estimate was even made without accounting for some of the effects of extra muscle mass that might have increased their pace. The genus also has noticeably larger arms than any other Western tyrannosaur, with hands bearing 2 functional fingers that each bore very large claws that were hooked and recurved for grasping and slashing. They never skipped arm day. Uniquely, the genus also has a vestigial 3rd finger that can be seen in the skeleton, but would have been invisible within the hand in life. I personally think they used it to make credible business agreements. Let me bring in Mr. Man from Animal Planet's The Most Extreme to show you what you're up against. Size-wise, Nanotyrannus lancensis was the smaller of the two. You're dealing with something roughly estimated at around 5 to 7 meters, 16 to 23 feet long, 1.7 meters, 5.5 feet tall, and 500 to 700 kilograms, based on measurements from Bloody Mary's femur. These estimates will be refined by upcoming volumetric analysis, so stay tuned for that. The other species, Nanotyrannus Lathaeus, was somewhat larger. The only known specimen, Jane, was still growing at the time of death. Jane is estimated around 7 to 8 meters, 23 to 26 feet long, 2 meters, 6.5 feet tall, and 800 kilograms. And it's considered plausible that a hypothetical fully grown adult individual might have been somewhere north of 1,200 kilograms. Still small for a tyrannosaur, but noticeably larger than the original holotype. Coincidentally, Nanotyrannus Lathaeus' adult size estimate is extremely similar to estimates for the eastern tyrannosaur Dryptosaurus. Remember this for later. Alright, thanks Mr. Man. Get on out of here! While the number of known juvenile tyrannosaur specimens has now noticeably dwindled, especially those that are available for public research and not in private collections, there are still a few known youthful tyrant kings out there open for study. Specimens LACM 23845, or Dinotyrannus, and TCM 2001.90.1, or Bucky, are still recognizable as young Tyrannosaurus rex. The former is only somewhat larger than most Nanotyrannus specimens, while Bucky is noticeably larger despite most adult T.rex specimens still dwarfing it. Phil Curry and colleagues' 2004 Nature study describing evolutionary changes among tyrannosauroids indicated both of these specimens were in their middle teens, with LACM 23845 roughly 14 years old, and the Bucky specimen a few years older. Despite the incomplete nature of these specimens, they still preserved distinguishing hallmarks of the heavily built tyrannosaurine part of the tyrannosaur family tree, such as reduced arms, robust jaws, and stout teeth. This means that even by their 15th year or so, Tyrannosaurus already had a robust frame compared to their Nanotyrannus kin, and would have rapidly outsized them within that time frame. Me and my big buff wife. Older reconstructions of known young T-rex used specimens now known to be Nanotyrannus, so the idea that young T-rex were extremely leggy, lean speed machines might need some reevaluation. They certainly were lighter built than their parents, but perhaps not by as much as previously thought. So if Nanotyrannus wasn't part of the Tyrannosaurinae and wasn't close to Tyrannosaurus, then what was it? As far back as the holotype's original description, other ideas were tested to find out what kin Tyrannosaurus had. The Cleveland skull was briefly labeled as a species of Gorgosaurus, and at a glance this comparison does make some sense. Albertosaurines were a group of tyrannosaurs that were quite common in the Campanian stage of the late Cretaceous, immediately before the very last epoch, the Maastrichtian, which includes the Lance and Hell Creek formations. This could have just been their end from environmental pressures. It could be that more formations need to be sampled from later times, or it could be that big buff mean old Tyrannosaurus came into the continent and stole the lunch money from these lighter, leaner athletes. The Albertosaurs have relatively gracile bodies and, like the Cleveland skull, sport skinnier snouts compared to Tyrannosaurines. The comparison to the Albertosaurs also aligns with ecology. Most late Cretaceous geologic formations preserve a heavy Tyrannosaur and a light Albertosaur. For example, Gorgosaurus and Daspletosaurus lived at the same time and place in the Dinosaur Park Formation of Canada. This also occurred in Asia with the Nemegt formations Tarbosaurus and Alioramus. So maybe the two body types really can live together. No body shaming, guys. Prior research indicates Tyrannosaurus was more closely related to Asiatic tyrannosaurians, like Tarbosaurus and Shushengytyrannus, than it was to native North American forms from the Campanian epoch. This implies a migration event occurred with Tyrannosaurus or its immediate forerunner, moving into Laramidia from Asia. They didn't care about borders back then. God, take me back. While they did take the top predator roles, some experts speculate that the native Albertosaurians might have survived by downsizing and adapting to a mesopredator role, eventually resulting in forms like Nanotyrannus. They got squashed into little man syndrome. An alternative hypothesis posits, assuming Nanotyrannus is valid, that its name might be coincidentally very fitting. Size is one of the most plastic traits of a species. If conditions are right for speciation, rapid changes in size can occur. The cougar, puma, or mountain lion is currently a top-order carnivore across most of North America. It's one of the largest hypercarnivores across most of the United States and Canada. However, the cougar has been endemic since the Pleistocene, where several species of felid outsized it, like jaguars, American lions, Smilodon, and Homotherium. Ironically, the Ice Age cougar was noticeably smaller than the modern form, suggesting the recent uptick in their size was a direct response to changing conditions and extinction of competition. An inverse of this relationship is also possible. So, some researchers proposed that Nanotyrannus might have been part of the same Asiatic Tyrannosaurian migration, but split from Tyrannosaurus, rapidly shrunk, and diverged. Turns out, Zanno and Napoli's work discovered several largely unexpected scenarios. Now, let me emphasize that the authors themselves have cautioned against using any of their preliminary phylogenetic data for ironclad classification. However, for the sake of argument, I'll go over some of the scenarios considered most likely because the results were genuinely surprising. Nanotyrannus exhibited numerous traits not seen in any other late Cretaceous tyrannosaurids, neither in North America nor Asia. There doesn't yet seem to be any direct ancestors in those regions, meaning either they haven't been discovered yet or that said ancestor wasn't from those regions. If not the West, then what better place to look for a beast than the East?
Oh, East? I thought you said West.
The 2025 research had 8 phylogenetic tree analysis results. Some found Nanotyrannus' closest kin included some of the most primitive and poorly understood tyrannosaurs, such as Moros, which some viewers may recognize from its shrunken baby form appearing in Jurassic World Dominion, the highly unusual eastern Appalachiosaurus, and the very first predatory dinosaur identified in North America, Dryptosaurus. Guess the 1988 authors who described the Cleveland skull were closer to a slam dunk than they even thought. Nanotyrannus' exact placement in this group is still uncertain. One tree analysis found it closest to the 90+ million-year-old Moros. This result was a little weird because it plopped Nanotyrannus Lathaeus closer to Moros than Nanotyrannus lancensis, which would obviously force one out of the species or genus name. 1. Figure 9a put all the Nanotyrannus specimens together as a group that split from the Tyrannosaurid tree before it split into the Albertosaurinae and Tyrannosaurinae. The authors have come up with the name Nanotyrannidae for this grouping. However, if it also includes things like Dryptosaurus, then the name would have to be Dryptosauridae. Like this result, figure 9b, which found the exact same thing as the last one I showed you, but has Dryptosaurus as the first one to diverge from the group, which then split into the 3 other groups. This one also has Moros as a nanotyrannid/Dryptosaurid closest to Pete the Nanotyrannus. This other one, figure 9b, has Dryptosaurus as the earliest one, and equally as closely related to a bunch of other tyrannosauroids that did not place close to Nanotyrannus: Suskytyrannus of New Mexico, Xiangguanlong of China, Timolangia of Uzbekistan, Electrosaurs of Mongolia, and Konglu of Mongolia. This result has Appalachiosaurus as the one right outside of the grouping of Tyrannosaurinae, Albertosaurinae, and the Nanotyrannidae. Next up is this result, figure 10a, which has the Nanotyrannidae as its own thing, and the earliest diverging, with the other branch going off into Moros and then the Tyrannosaurinae and Albertosaurinae. The last one here, figure 10D, has all of the Nanotyrannus specimens plus Dryptosaurus and Appalachiosaurus together as part of what should be a Dryptosauridae that diverged from the Tyrannosauridae/Albertosauridae group, which would be the true Tyrannosauridae, I think. Lots of people have jumped on the tree that has Dryptosaurus and Appalachiosaurus as the closest relatives of the Nanotyrannus group. Dryptosaurus is most well known from a Charles Knight painting called Leaping Laelaps, which was the original name for the dinosaur before it was found to be occupied by a measly little mite. Despite its distressingly scrappy material, many experts have tentatively reconstructed the animal with relatively large arms and claws and a narrow snout. These traits are suspiciously similar to Bloody Mary, which did not go unnoticed when preliminary photos of Bloody Mary were disseminated online between 2006 and 2011. It just so happens that Dryptosaurus and Nanotyrannus were around at the same time too. The region Dryptosaurus and Appalachiosaurus called home was the reason for the latter's name. For most of the late Cretaceous, North America was divided straight down the middle by a shallow inland sea, aptly named the Western Interior Seaway. The continent to the left is called Laramidia, and the one to the right is Appalachia. The rock records don't seem to preserve much evidence of a land bridge connecting the two halves until that slaggy little seaway began to regress back to where it belonged, away from the land. This did explain why the terrestrial fauna didn't seem to have much overlap, with only amphibious species like crocodilians or flighted species like pterosaurs and birds on both sides. However, researchers Jason Lilligraven and Lawrence Ostresch published research in the Geological Society of America in 1990, finding the Western Interior Seaway began receding around 86 million years ago and shrank considerably by the end of the Cretaceous. These results aren't definitive as to whether or not this would have been enough to allow for some permanent or temporary land bridges, with the only known definitive crossings after the Cretaceous in the Paleocene. Nanotyrannus, as either a close relative of or descendant of creatures like Dryptosaurus, would be some of the earliest evidence that non-avian dinosaurs were able to cross the seaway. Whether it was land bridges or island hopping or the ocean receding enough that swimming would have been possible under the right conditions remains to be seen. Both Zanno and Napoli have cautioned against jumping on this result, as it is preliminary, and only one of the 8 results found Dryptosaurus to be even remotely closely related to Nanotyrannus. They are still currently working on publishing more about the specimen and potentially others, so this could all be a false positive or convergent evolution. Don't run with this one possibility among many. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.